All right. You are listening to Ever Vigilant with me, Joe Prim. If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, thanks for tuning in. I do appreciate it and hope you enjoy the show. If you are coming back for more, thanks to you. If you get a chance and you enjoy the podcast, I would appreciate you leaving a review on whatever platform you listen on iTunes or Spreaker or wherever else you listen to the podcast. That helps me out, gives me a little bit more exposure, and helps me get news of this podcast out there. Share it with friends, share it on Twitter, Instagram, wherever you find this podcast. I would really appreciate that. Got a few changes coming up. Hopefully the next podcast, we will have a new intro and outro. And I've been working on that a little bit, something I've been thinking about doing for a long time, and finally did it, took the big step. So we'll see. Something's supposed to be in the works right now. We'll see how it turns out, and hopefully you guys like it. The Vigilant Wolf website is up and running, and I have a Black Friday sale going on right now for 25% off on the website. The code is BF25, and that'll get you 25% off the holsters and magazine carriers on the website. So if you haven't yet, go check out that website. Tell me what you think. Give me any suggestions for changes that you think could be made on the website to make it better. I would appreciate it. The men's grooming products will be on the website shortly. So while you're there, go ahead and subscribe on the website, and then I can keep you up to date on what's going on with products, what's going on with sales, what's going on with the homestead, and when new podcasts become available. So when you get a chance, check out vigilantwolf.com and subscribe while you're there. This podcast is going to be on the OODA Loop. If you know what the OODA Loop is and have studied the OODA Loop, stay tuned. I have a few different takes on it, going back to source materials by John Boyd and not changing it around to personalize it, but just trying to clarify some things and get a little bit deeper, but also simplify things so that we can use the OODA Loop daily in all of our decision making. If you don't know what the OODA Loop is, you're in for a treat. The OODA Loop is a decision-making tool that was invented by a man named John Boyd. John Boyd was a fighter pilot and Pentagon consultant. He was a fighter pilot in the Korean War, flying 22 missions in F-86 Sabres. He had no confirmed kills. In fact, he was a wingman on every one of those missions. After his service in Korea, he was invited to attend a flight weapons school. He rose to the top of his class and was invited to stay on as an instructor. At the time in the 50s, that was a very coveted and very special position to be an instructor at the flight weapons school. At age 33, he wrote the Aerial Attack Study, which put together the best dogfighting tactics in one place for the first time. This book became the Bible of air combat and revolutionized air forces all over the world. He also helped develop the energy maneuverability theory, which is a math equation that compresses velocity, thrust, drag, and weight into a single value. This mathematical equation helped to develop the legendary F-15, F-16, and the A-10, all of which are still in service today. This brings us to the topic of today, maybe John's greatest work, and certainly his most important work, the OODA Loop. The OODA stand for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. There are many variations out there of the OODA Loop, everybody kind of likes to put their own personal twist on things. Boyd was a very, very deep man and put a lot of time and thinking into the OODA Loop. And it's one of those things where you can twist it and change it up as much as you want, but I think it's important that on theories and thoughts like this that we go back to the source and look to the source for learning, because that's where the time and energy went into it. And a lot of the variations and a lot of the twist on the OODA Loop put less emphasis on the Orient part, and John Boyd thought that was the most important part of the OODA Loop. The first O in the OODA Loop stands for observe. And this is a lot what I talked about in the open concept on Open Your Eyes, which I will be updating soon. It's been over a year since I made those podcasts, so those will be getting an update and a facelift soon. But anyway, observe comes down to knowing what's going on around you. Examples would be checking your mirrors when you're driving, knowing where the exits and entrances are when you go into a restaurant or a store or your daily place of work, noticing cues that may be a danger, the lights out in a parking lot, or the street light out on the street, or your front porch light out, looking for signs that could lead to a potential threat. Knowing the analytics for your websites, keeping up with the trends for your business, and understanding and trusting your gut that there are a lot of times things that you are observing and noticing that you might not realize that you're observing and noticing, which is the premise of a great book by Gavin DeBecker called The Gift of Fear, which if you haven't read, you should check out. It's all about understanding that gut feeling that we get sometimes, and understanding that a lot of times we're seeing, smelling, hearing something that we don't quite notice or don't have a full recognition of, but we're realizing in our gut that there's an issue there and something that we need to take precaution of, and realizing why it's so important to trust it. So if you haven't checked out that book by Gavin DeBecker, although I don't agree with everything in his book, it's an eye-opener. So if you haven't checked it out, check out that book again by Gavin DeBecker. The name of the book is The Gift of Fear. So basically, observe is as it sounds. It's just having an idea, being in a condition where you are paying attention to what's going on around you. And like I talk about in the open concept, to open your eyes, a lot of people in our world today have their heads in their cell phones as they're walking down the street, or just not paying attention, just daydreaming and focusing on what's going on inside of them versus what's going on outside of them. But observing brings with it a couple of issues. Too much information would be one, and knowing what is relevant. Examples of that would be looking at the analytics for your website and sorting through all the minutia that's involved there, or a regular behavior by a stranger that's around you, and realizing that that is not always the sign of a threat. Same with a parking lot light being out. But there's so much going on around you that it's easy to have too much information. The other issue with observing is that the information will always be incomplete. And the reason why your information will always be incomplete is because you can only observe what's going on from your vantage point. You can only hear, smell, taste, and see from where you are located at that given moment. You don't know what's going on over a ridge. You don't know what's going on down the hallway. You don't know what's going on if it's dark outside. And the other key point here about vantage point is knowledge. The need for knowledge is what brings us to the next point, which is Orient. Franz P.B. Ozinga, who wrote a book on John Boyd and the OODA Loop called Science, Strategy, and War, wrote, "It is not necessarily the one with more info who will come out victorious. It is the one with better judgment, the one who is better at discerning patterns." So in order to make quick decisions and smart decisions, we need Orient. This is why Orient is the most important. It influences the way we observe, decide, and act. Orient is critical. So the second O in the OODA Loop is Orient. Boyd thought this was the most important, and you will understand why after we get into it here a bit. Here's a thought exercise that Boyd used in his presentations to help people understand what Orient meant. Imagine that you were on a ski slope with other skiers, that you were in Florida riding in an outboard motorboat, maybe even towing water skiers. Imagine that you were riding a bicycle on a nice spring day. Imagine that you were a parent taking your son to a department store, and that you notice he is fascinated by toy tractors or tanks with rubber caterpillar treads. Now imagine that we pull the skis, but you are still on a ski slope. Imagine that we remove the outboard motor from the motorboat, and you are no longer in Florida. And from the bicycle, you remove the handlebar and discard the rest of the bike. Finally, you take the rubber treads from the toy tractor or tanks. This leaves you with the following separate pieces: skis, outboard motor, handlebars, and rubber treads. That leaves you with the pieces to make a snowmobile. Orienting is taking the snippets of knowledge that you acquire from here and there and using them along with your observances to make the best decision you can at that moment. Boyd said, "A loser is someone, an individual or group, who cannot build snowmobiles when facing uncertainty and unpredictable change, whereas a winner is someone who can build snowmobiles and employ them in an appropriate fashion when facing uncertainty and unpredictable change." We must always be gathering as much intelligence or as much information as we possibly can, whether that be reading the Bible or reading The Gift of Fear by Gavin DeBecker, like I was talking about earlier, or listening to lectures by people like William April who talk about understanding the threats that are around us on a daily basis psychologically, to reading books or trade magazines, watching lectures on understanding the analytics on your website. You are constantly learning and getting as much information as possible in as many different areas as possible so that you have as much information as you can to help you make quick decisions. But in this, even when we have a lot of information, and we've spent a lot of time studying different subjects and having as many possible after-action reports. Another example would be something like fishing, knowing what weather works with what color for what type of fish. All of that knowledge is what Orient is about. But even with all this knowledge, we must be careful because life is fluid and always changing. Tactics, ideas, understanding, and info are always changing. We cannot be dogmatic in our approach to decision-making or orienting. We must take great pains not to do things because this is the way we have always done them, or there is only one way to do them. Don't get stuck on stupid. A personal example of getting stuck on what you do every day is a couple years ago I was working on a construction project, and we were doing all the finished work on this construction project, and the boss called me over. He had some new thing for me to work on, and he went through this long, lengthy instruction of how he wanted to do something that was very simple. The way he explained it to me would have taken hours to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. I listened to him thoroughly and respectfully looked at him after he gave me these instructions and said, "You have your head stuck on trim work. I have a better way to do this." At this time, this guy trusted me. We had worked together for a long time, I solved it in a completely different manner because I did not have my head stuck in finish work. I knew how to do other types of construction also, and was able to incorporate my knowledge from past work into what I was doing on that day, and was able to fix the problem and convince him that I could fix the problem, and was able to get it done in a half hour versus hours. But that's a perfect example of getting your head stuck in the way we always do things, or in a specific way of looking at things, right? If you have a hammer, everything you're looking at is a nail. This is what John Boyd said about this. Well, I understand you're going to have to write military doctrine, and that's all right. But even after you write it, assume it's not right, and look at a whole lot of other doctrines, German doctrine, other kinds of doctrines, and learn those too. Then you've got a bunch of doctrines, and the reason you want to learn them all is so that you're not captured by any one, and you can lift stuff out of here, stuff out of there. You can put your snowmobile together, and you do better than anyone else. If you got one doctrine, you're a dinosaur, period. As I talk about in Open Your Mind, in the open concept, we must not be afraid to challenge our own beliefs. In the end, there will only be two conclusions. Either you'll change your mind because of new facts, or your original opinion and belief will be stronger based on the new facts from taking the time to challenge your belief and go through it again. The more knowledge from different sources with new or different views, the more resources you have for building your snowmobile. This brings us to D in the OODA Loop for decide. Make your decisions based on your observances and on your orientating. Remember, your decision can only be based on your information, knowledge, or experiences, and your observances, which will never be complete or perfect. Again, this is why orienting is so important. In the fourth part of the OODA Loop is A for act, and it doesn't end there. And here's Boyd explaining why it doesn't end there. You got to get an image or picture in your head, which we call orientation. Then we have to make a decision as to what we're going to do, and then implement that decision, act. Then we look at the resulting action plus our new observation, and we drag that new data, new orientation, new decision, new action ad infinitum. So again, it doesn't stop there. The loop starts back over again. What's changed since we did our action? What are the observable changes? What new information did we gather for orienting? And again, we go through that. Then we decide. Then we act. Then we go back around, back to observing what were the consequences of that action. What did we learn from it? We keep the loop, can keep cycling over and over and over. An easy analogy for this, for me, is similar to playing Battleship. You sit down to play Battleship with your son, or you sat down to play Battleship with your dad, and if you've played with them before, or many times before, you have a lot of orienting. You know if they usually put their battleship on the outside, or if they like to keep their aircraft carrier on the inside, or if they keep all their battleships on the inside, or they always go towards the edges. Maybe you know by the hand gestures, or your dad, the way he's looking at the board, if you came close to hitting one of his battleships. So that's a simplified version of your orientation. But then you make a decision. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and fire at B3. So I know usually he has something in that vicinity. Now if I get a hit at B3, I start the loop over again, right? I orientated. What's my new data? My new data is that I hit one of the ships, I don't know which one, on B3. So now, where am I going to go for my next hit? My next turn, let's hit B4. I missed. I didn't hit anything. So now the loop starts over again. Now I have more information. I know that I didn't hit anything on B4. That changes the dynamic of the game because I know that I need to find a new location and find which direction his ship could be facing. So just like that, that's a very simplified version of understanding the loop. It doesn't stop after you've made your decision and acted on it. We now have more information. We've collected more information. We can go ahead and start the loop over again. This is why we cannot be afraid and get stuck on the acting point either. Because people spend decades or even the better parts of their lives researching, reading, and thinking about making a decision. They're collecting orientation. They're constantly orienting about a career change, having children, getting married, moving to a new location. Like I said earlier, your info and knowledge will never be perfect. That is why we get to loop back around again, learning from our experiences. New people that we meet, if we stay static in our comfort zone, not allowing our ideas, dreams, or callings to manifest, we have no one to blame but ourselves and our lack of confidence in ourselves and in the one who created us and created those dreams and gave us those visions or missions. Here's a final quote by John Boyd on why we cannot remain static. Under the OODA Loop theory, every combatant observes the situation, orients himself, and decides what to do, and then does it. If his opponent can do this faster, however, his own actions become outdated and disconnected to the true situation, and his opponent's advantage increases geometrically. So, another example of why you need to act. Big corporations make this mistake a lot, right? Blockbuster, Kodak, for example. They stay static. They've had success where they're at, and they're afraid to move forward, afraid to make changes, and in the end, they end up losing out, either because they're too big to move, or because they don't have the foresight or not, or making the observances, or are, like I was just saying before, they're afraid to move and take the risks. So I wanted to find an example of the OODA Loop in the Bible, and I think the story of David and Goliath exemplifies the OODA Loop and is a great example of the OODA Loop and how the OODA Loop works. We all know the story of David and Goliath, but if you haven't read it out of the Bible before, or haven't read it out of the Bible in a while, go back and check it out. There's a lot there that you don't pick up on the cleaned up Disney version of the story. So I'm going to hit on some verses and So basically, Israel is at war with the Philistines, and David's brothers are all fighters. They're all warriors in this fight. So David, at this time, all his older brothers are away at war, and his job is to watch the sheep. He's a shepherd. His father asks him to take some food to the front lines to give to his brothers. He takes the food and heads out to go meet up with his brothers. And as he's sharing the food with his brothers and he's talking to his brothers, probably catching up on what's going on, this happens. And this is 1 Samuel 17, verse 4. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, I will become your subjects. If I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." So David shows up, eating with his brothers, talking with his brothers probably about what's going on with his father and back home, and this giant comes out with massive armor on display and challenges the army. So this is what David's observing. He's observing the fear and the fright in the Israelites, in his brothers, and the whole camp is afraid of this giant. He's observing the giant. He's observing his armor, how he carries himself. He's observing how much his armor weighed. All these are observances that he's taking at that moment. So David realizes that he observes that there is a clear and present threat to not only his family, but his country, and he starts to orient. In verse 17, or verse 26, chapter 17, David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes his disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So he starts asking questions. So he's asking questions and raising a stink about this giant challenging not only him and his country, but also their God. He raises such a stink that he ends up getting a front row seat to visit King Saul. So King Saul basically tells him, you're just a young man. You cannot go out and fight against this giant. He's been training to be a warrior since he was a child. And in verse 34, this is David's response. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." Again, Orient. He's not just some weak little shepherd boy. He was obviously in good shape. He was obviously strong. He obviously knew how to fight, and he obviously was fearless. But these things only come with experience. So he had the experience part of Orient. So in verse 38, he continues to talk with and orient with King Saul. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened his sword over his tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch in his shepherd's bag, and put his sling in his hand, and approached the Philistine. So David shows up at the camp. He observes what's going on. He orients himself by speaking to his brothers and other men in the camp, speaking to King Saul, tries on Saul's armor, doesn't fit, not going to work for him. But again, he challenged the way that he normally thought and went ahead and gave the armor a try. It failed. It didn't work out. He moved on, went back to going without the armor where he felt comfortable. But the most important part of his orienting was his relationship with God. He trusted God. He trusted that just with his staff and 5 stones, he would be able to defeat this giant. All the other orienting was important and is necessary in order to make this decision, but the most important orienting happened with him and his relationship with God. Then he decided to follow God's leading and to go after the giant, and then he acted. We'll resume in verse 41. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "What am I, a dog, that you should come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David's reply, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, and God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine armies to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that this is not by sword or spear, but by the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, taking out a stone, slinging it, struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank deep into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with his sling and a stone, and without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took out the Philistine's sword and drew it from his scabbard, and after he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. All those experiences, all the difficulties that David went through, fighting bears, fighting lions, all that experience gave him the courage to do what he needed to do. So next time you're going through something difficult and a hard time, remember, God is preparing you for something. Well, I've got to wrap this up. I'm running out of time here. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it around, spread it around, share it with other men in your lives, other friends, family that you think might be encouraged or might learn something from this. I would really appreciate it. Follow me on Instagram at The Ever Vigilant. Again, The Ever Vigilant on Instagram. I'm always posting stuff on there, pictures of the animals on the homestead, projects that I'm working on, holsters, the sales that I have going on with the holsters. Follow along with what I got going on. If you have any suggestions on how I could make the podcast better, any thoughts or ideas on topics, please share them with me. You can shoot me an email at evervigilantpodcast@gmail.com. And again, if you would, check out vigilantwolf.com. Check out the holsters I'm making. The male grooming products will be up there soon. Check it out. Let me know what you think. While you're on there, subscribe, and I'll keep you up to date on what's going on. Upcoming podcasts should include in the next couple weeks a podcast going over new gear that I purchased this year, kind of review of what I liked and what I didn't like. Mostly likes this year, actually. I ended up with some pretty cool kit. I will be updating and redoing the Open Concept podcast just because all that stuff was my original podcast. I really was bad at doing this. I've progressed quite a bit over this last year. I have a lot of new ideas and thoughts behind that and would like to add some scriptures to the Open Concept. Another thing that I'm really going to be pushing here in the future, along with trying to get some interviews with different men and get their perspective on what's going on with men and masculinity right now in our society, is really pushing the theme of pack and the importance of us being very intentional about building packs, because as Rudyard Kipling hit it so perfectly, and this is going to be a constant theme throughout the podcast, the website, you're going to see it everywhere, is the lines from his poem, The Law of the Jungle. And that's, for the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. Because I want to point out, guys, remember, a lone wolf is a dead wolf. We need to be very intentional about starting to form up packs and start to build brotherhoods, because times are not getting any better. Times are getting more difficult, and the more we try to sit out by ourselves, we become lone ducks. We become easy targets for both Satan and for other enemies. The more we're banded together, the tighter we are as groups, the more accountable we are, the more disciplined we are, the stronger we become. And the new tagline for this podcast is, our mission is to encourage and challenge men to prepare, defend, and lead at home and in their communities. And that's going to be the driving force behind Ever Vigilant in the future. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed the show. Again, hit me up with any comments, thoughts. I would appreciate it. And prayers. Thanks, brothers. Hold fast, and God bless.